Teaching presence requires that I think a little bit about how I'm going to be asking my students to both read texts in a lit class, and also how to investigate texts online. And so one of the articles that I came across from a teacher's perspective is This Is Your Brain on Jane Austen. I read this a while back. It's been an ongoing project. This was sort of an older report from 2012, but basically it shows and argues that students, there's a difference between pleasure reading and sort of reading for purpose. And I'm asking students in this particular short fiction class to be reading with purpose. And so in order to have students engage with them in terms of reading practice or best reading practices, whether it's online or with a textbook, is to think a little bit about how we read and to provide students with some sort of guidelines and some direction, perhaps questions, specific discussion thoughts to be having, to be working towards particular projects as a means through reading and noticing particular items within their short story. So that's something I will be thinking about including in my class from the teacher presence perspective, is how do I, or what do I include in terms of the kinds of questions, the kinds of interactions I'm looking for students to have with their texts. Another thing I'm going to ask students to be thinking about in terms of fostering social presence, the ability of learners to project their own personal characteristics into the community of inquiry, is how do they want to display their ability to read closely and carefully to their peers. One example might be to ask students to record themselves reading a particular passage with a particular emphasis on a word or a phrase or a dialogue that characters are having. Students, maybe I notice in class in face-to-face sessions, are maybe more reluctant to read or less reluctant to read than others. And so another option for students to project their social presence is to try out Hypotheses, which is an online annotation tool. It's considered like a peer review layer for the internet. It's open source software, and it usually appears as a plugin. So here I have it up at the top right of my screen. I'll show you any sort of thing I read online I can annotate, and that annotation I can share with others. And so, for example, if I want to have my students try reading The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe, typically I'm working from a textbook, so I'll have to see how this will work, how I can kind of translate this online. But oftentimes there are PDFs of the short stories that we're reading. And so one of the things you might do is ask the students then if either they want to read a passage or if they'd rather maybe annotate or do both, is to ask them to investigate this plugin, Hypotheses, open up the PDF online, and they can begin, if you look at the right here, annotating the text, and not only annotating, but then replying to other annotations that we see there. I have mine set as public, so anyone searching for this particular website can look and find my annotations. As long as they have the Hypotheses plugin. So one thing my students might be wondering is, what exactly is this Latin expression that's sort of opening here? And I've included a translation of it over and highlighted the text and included a translation. The other thing I was wondering is, can you use multimodal strategies with a multimodal approach? And so the other thing then is to see if I can include what is a meerschaum, and I've added a comment here. Let's see if you can see it in a link. So instead of explaining what exactly it is, I have a picture, and it's a specific kind of pipe. So and the student could also reply to this. That could be thinking about cognitive presence. I might ask students to construct meaning in a particular way. So I might ask students to find some language that they want to investigate further. I might ask students to interpret a particular passage or a particular phrase or interaction. And so in that way, the cognitive presence can be directed towards a particular outcome in this Hypotheses platform.